My name is Gregory. I'm a man who built his life with quiet discipline, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, and regret by regret. I'm the kind of man who never left a tie wrinkled or a contract unsigned. At 62, I had it all. A respectable business, a lakeside house that echoed with silence, and a heart that had long stopped expecting surprises. And yet every single morning I bought flowers. I'd step into the little corner shop on Sycamore Street, Lavender and Grief. An odd name, perhaps, but it fit. The place always smelled like spring pressed into memory. Sharp eucalyptus, damp roses, and fading paper notes tucked into wrapping. Scented melancholy. Sandra owned the place. She wasn't young, not in the way that draws glances, but her smile, it was the kind that made you feel like you'd been found rather than greeted. She always wore this threadbare blue apron and a tiny gold pin shaped like a watering can. I never asked about it, though I imagined there was a story behind it, maybe a husband lost to time or a son who moved too far away. "Roses again, Mr. Carter?" she'd ask with that knowing glint. "Not today," I'd reply some mornings. "Today feels like peonies, something a little louder than usual." She never questioned my choices, only made them bloom with her hands. I wasn't buying flowers for Sandra, though. Not yet. They were for my wife, Claire. Well, second wife. Met Claire on a red-eye flight from Boston to Seattle. She was sitting in the aisle seat beside mine, legs crossed in ripped jeans, camera strapped across her chest like some modern-day gunslinger. She smiled at me before I even sat down, and I remember thinking, that smile is not for someone like me. That's a fire escape smile, meant for exits, not entrances. But she talked to me anyway about film photography, about how digital images were soulless, about how she wanted to capture people as they really were, not how they pretended to be. She told me she once photographed a funeral and said it was the most honest day of her life. I told her I sold industrial supplies, and she said, "Even factories have poetry, Greg. No one had called me Greg in years." The way she said it made me feel 20 again. 8 months later, we got married. We chose a location that felt like a metaphor, a crumbling lighthouse on the edge of Bainbridge Island. The fog that morning clung to everything like soft grief. Only 12 guests, no wedding party, no DJ. Just a violinist who played Claire de Lune as she walked down the makeshift aisle in bare feet. She looked like a dream I once had, but could never remember fully when I woke up. During our vows, she didn't. "Look me in the eye, I noticed." I told myself it was nerves. I lied to myself beautifully. Our first few months were cinematic. She'd played jazz from a Bluetooth speaker while dancing barefoot in the kitchen, wearing my shirts as dresses. I'd come home late, tired from meetings and paperwork, only to find her editing photos in our living room, surrounded by empty wine glasses and strangers' faces, frozen in black and white on her laptop. "Let's go to Paris," she said one night at 2 a.m. while lying on the floor, legs propped up against the wall. "I have meetings," I murmured. "God, you're old," she laughed, then kissed me. I laughed too, but the comment landed like a seed in my chest. It wasn't the first time she called me that. Claire was everything I wasn't. Chaotic, creative, irreverent. Her world was filled with gallery openings, wine and cheese rooftop parties, brunches that lasted until sunset, and people who wore linen all year round. I was used to mahogany desks, tight schedules, and the comfort of knowing where I'd be tomorrow. Still, I kept buying her flowers. Even when she stopped putting them in water, she'd leave them on the counter for days, petals curling into fists. Once, I found a bouquet tossed behind the kitchen door, forgotten and brittle. I didn't say a word. You see, for me, flowers were never just gifts. They were apologies I didn't know how to phrase. They were love letters folded in silence. And I kept sending them, hoping she'd one day read between the stems. But our home grew quieter with every passing week, despite her noise. She'd be gone for days at photography workshops or collaborations with young artists I'd never met. I told myself it was fine. This was the life she needed, and I could adapt. After all, hadn't I found her in turbulence? Maybe I thought I could hold on to her by keeping my hands soft and open. But some people aren't meant to be held. They're meant to pass through, like light through a prism, beautiful and ungraspable. Still, every time I stepped into lavender and grief, Sandra would hand me another bouquet and I'd smile like everything was fine. "Say hi to Claire for me," she'd say. "I will," I'd lie, and maybe Sandra knew. Maybe that's why she never asked. The first time I truly noticed the change, it came wrapped in scent. Claire returned home late, later than usual. It was nearly 2 a.m. I heard her key fumble in the lock, then the click of her boots crossing the hardwood. She paused in the entryway, perhaps checking if I was asleep. I was, or I should have been. I lay still, eyes shut, breathing even. She didn't turn on the lights, but she brought the smell with her. It wasn't hers. Claire usually smelled like lemon balm, film chemicals, and a faint trace of red wine. But that night it was something different, an expensive, musky cologne I didn't recognize. Not mine, not hers, not unnoticeable. I heard the creak of her camera bag dropping on the chair, the zipper pulling. Then the bathroom door closed. In the dark, I whispered to myself, maybe it's the assistants. Maybe someone hugged her goodbye, but my hands were clenched under the sheets. I didn't ask. She didn't explain. And that became the pattern. Few days later, I was in her office looking for a spare battery for my laptop. Claire had gone out to brunch with a friend, one of those new names she always brought up casually, like they'd been close forever. Devin? Dylan? Something ambiguous and photogenic. Her workspace was chaos. Stacks of negatives, curled photo prints, post-it notes with phrases like "lighten a trust" and "find the story, not the smile." I admired her passion, but lately it felt like I was watching it from behind glass. In the corner of the desk was a silver USB stick, unlabeled, out of place. I picked it up without thinking, like a man reaching into a drawer and pulling out a piece of the truth by accident. Plugged it in. Folders. Dozens of them. Names of clients, locations, events. Then, one stood out. Untitled, personal. The thumbnails loaded slowly. Claire always shot in RAW. The first few were standard. Cityscapes, abstract shadows, a black cat curled in a windowsill. Then came the portraits. Black and white. Intimate. One photo showed her bareback, smooth, freckled, vulnerable, against white sheets. The next, a man's hand resting on her hip. Only his hand. Strong fingers, a watch I didn't recognize. Her face was turned away, blurred just enough to seem artistic, but I knew it was her. Every curve of her shoulder confirmed it. The angle wasn't accidental. Nothing in Claire's work ever was. My mouth went dry. Still, I told myself it could be a conceptual series, an artistic expression. She'd always been bold. Maybe it was for an exhibit. But why hide it? Why tuck it away on a flash drive labeled personal? I closed the file. Sat in her chair for a long time. My heart beat so loud I could hear the rhythm echo in the heating ducts. Later that evening, I brought it up, carefully. "You been working on anything new lately?" "For yourself, I mean." She blinked, a flash of tension behind her lashes. "Not really." "Why?" "Just wondering. You used to show me your favorites." She smiled. But it was a tired smile. Not tired from work. Tired of me. "You wouldn't get this one. It's more abstract. Not your thing, my thing." That's what I'd become. A style she'd outgrown. That night, I scrolled through Instagram. Not mine. Hers was locked, curated, full of cryptic captions and washed-out edits. But I remembered the name of one of her photography partners, Zane Lark. His profile was the opposite of Claire's. Chaotic, loud, filled with party shots and oversharing. I clicked on his latest post. A rooftop gathering. String lights. Neon cocktails. And there, dead center, Claire. Sitting on the lap of a guy wearing the same style watch I'd seen on the USB photo. She was laughing, head thrown back, holding a disposable camera. The caption? Muse of the night. Again. I stared at that word. Again. Clicked through the rest of his feed. She was in 5 other photos. Always close to him. Always framed like she was the center of the room. And never a single mention of me. The next morning, she came home with a latte in one hand and paint on her jeans. "Look what someone spilled on me," She laughed, showing me a blue smear across her thigh. I just nodded. I didn't ask why her hair looked different, or who made her coffee, or why she didn't come home last night. Instead, I walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and took out the last of the flowers I'd given her. They were dry, wilted. A few petals clung to the glass like a final apology. I threw them in the trash. I tried not to count her footsteps in the dark, I later told myself, but every step she took away from me sliced across my nerves like a violin out of tune. I wasn't ready to confront her, but the silence between us had started to hum, like feedback from an old amp. And deep down, I knew. Something was coming, something loud. The key still fit. She gave it to me the day she signed the lease on her studio, a converted loft on the 3rd floor of a brick building downtown, all glass and charm and raw edges. "You're part of my world now," she had said, dropping the silver key into my palm. "You never have to knock." Today, I did not knock. I brought flowers, again. This time I chose them carefully, deep black calla lilies wrapped in burnt orange tissue, accented with ranunculus the color of drying blood, a bouquet that whispered final chapters. The florist, Sandra, had looked at me for a second too long when I asked for something unforgettable. Now I was outside Claire's studio door, the familiar 3C etched into the smoked glass, and I turned the key with fingers steady but cold. The latch clicked open. The air inside was warm, tinged with the scent of incense, sweat, and espresso, and, then, laughter. Not hers alone, his too. It was low and intimate, a private noise that didn't belong to outsiders. But I knew that laugh. Claire's, I mean. I had memorized it. I could tell you the exact tone of her chuckle when she was pretending to be amused, the light exhale when she was truly charmed, and the giggle she saved for when she was flirting. The one I heard now? That was the one she used when we kissed in a cafe on our second date, when she still wanted me. Back when I still mattered. Only now, I was not part of the room that laugh filled. I stepped inside. Quiet. Measured. There she was. Claire. Wearing nothing but an oversized white shirt that hung just below her thighs. His shirt. Barefoot, her legs curled on a weathered leather couch, her head resting on the shoulder of a man at least 15 years younger than her. A camera lay beside them, the strap half hanging to the floor. She hadn't heard me yet. I watched for a moment, suspended between fury and disbelief. Then he turned. His body stiffened. She followed his eyes. Her smile faltered. "Greg," she said. Just my name, just like that. Like I was interrupting a photo shoot. "I used the key," I said. My voice was steady, but something inside me cracked quietly, like ice under a slow footstep. She stood quickly, pulling the shirt closed around her. It didn't matter. Nothing covered what I'd already seen. "Wait, Greg, I can explain." But she didn't get far. Behind me, I heard his voice, sarcastic, careless. "You're not actually thinking of having a kid with that guy, are you?" Claire laughed nervously. "That flirt laugh again?" "Of course not," she said too quickly. "He doesn't even know how to use TikTok. What would I do with a retirement plan in a cardigan?" They thought I'd already left. I hadn't. I walked over to her work table and placed the bouquet down gently, like laying flowers at a grave. Then I turned and walked out, closing the door behind me with the silence of a verdict. I didn't drive. Right away. I sat in the car, staring at the wheel, at my hands, at the world that continued to move outside the windshield, as if it hadn't just collapsed behind me. And then I looked at the watch on my wrist, Omega, DeVille Prestige. Elegant, subtle, a gift from Claire on our first anniversary. She'd given it to me during a dinner by candlelight, in a box lined with deep blue velvet. "For your time," she had whispered then, fastening it around my wrist. "Because I want to spend it all with you." Now it ticked against my skin like a mockery. I unfastened the leather strap slowly and placed the watch back in its original case, which I'd kept in the glove box all this time, because I was that kind of man, the kind who keeps the box, the kind who remembers the words. She gave me time, I thought. And now she had taken it back, second by second. The lawyer didn't ask questions. Ben and I had been friends for decades. He heard my voice and knew. "I'll make it clean," he said. "You won't have to see her again if you don't want to." "I don't," I said. But I did. For closure. Claire tried to reach me. She sent texts, left voice messages, even emailed me a playlist titled Us, like a soundtrack could undo Betrayal. Eventually, she came to my office unannounced. She wore a tight beige coat, her hair pulled back, and the same watch she'd once given me now hanging loosely on her own wrist. She looked like a memory trying to dress itself up as the future. "Greg," she started, "I messed up. I was scared. You were so distant." "No," I interrupted. "I was still. That's not the same." She blinked, confused. Her charm didn't work here. Not in this room. Not with me. "I miss what we had," she whispered. "What you had," I corrected. "I was never even in the frame." Security escorted her out quietly. She didn't fight it. I returned to my office, shut the door, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe. Claire could keep her studio, her camera, her lies. Let her immortalize someone else. I was done being the man behind the lens. It took me 3 weeks to return. I didn't plan it. I didn't think, today I'll walk back into the flower shop. I simply found myself there, one foot in front of the other, like a man tracing the outline of an old habit, hoping it still fit. The bell above the door jingled, same as always. The scent hit me before the warmth did. Sweet eucalyptus, soil, faint traces of lavender, and something sugary beneath it all. It smelled like a time when I still believed in flowers, when I still believed they could change something. Sandra was standing behind the counter, wearing that familiar blue apron and a pair of gardening gloves dusted in pollen. She looked up, paused, and then gave me the softest smile I'd seen in weeks. "Mr. Carter," she said gently, "you've been a ghost." I stepped inside, unsure if I wanted to stay. "I've been elsewhere," I figured. "You had the look." "What look is that?" "The look of a man who just remembered something worth forgetting." I let out a quiet laugh. She always had a way of putting things like that, straight to the point, but without the sting. I walked past a display of sunflowers, ran my fingers across the petals like they were braille for something I hadn't learned to read yet. "Funny," I said. "I came in out of habit, but I don't know who I'm buying for." Sandra tilted her head. "You don't have to know. Some flowers are just meant to be handed over, no questions asked." She picked up a single pink carnation and held it out like a peace offering. "You look like you could use a conversation," she added. I took it, not the flower, the offer. We sat on 2 old stools behind the counter, where customers never saw. The wall behind us was filled with Polaroids of bouquets from years past, little notes scribbled on some. "Sorry again?" She said yes. "You were right." Sandra poured us both tea from a thermos that looked like it had outlived 3 marriages. It tasted like chamomile and cinnamon and something slightly bitter. "So?" she said after a few moments of silence. "What happened?" To her, I hesitated, then told her. Not the scandalous version. Not the TikTok jokes or the borrowed shirts. Just the truth. The laugh that wasn't mine anymore. The key that unlocked a door I wished I'd never opened. The emptiness of a gift I thought was time. "When I finished, she nodded, slow and understanding. "My husband left me," she said. 10 years ago, for his fitness trainer. She was 27. He thought muscles would solve mortality. And did they? No, she smiled. He tore his rotator cuff trying to do a handstand push-up. She left him after 2 months. We both laughed. Genuinely this time. Not to hide anything, just because it was funny in the kind of way life tends to be after the worst part has passed. "He wrote me a letter once," she added. "Told me he made a mistake. Did you answer?" "No, I kept the letter. Burned the envelope." A few days later I returned. This time, with no excuse and no hesitations, I brought her a bouquet. No card, no name, no explanation, just flowers. Deep red zinnias, peach roses, and a single stem of rosemary. "For remembrance," she told me once. Sandra blinked when I handed it to her. "These are—" "For you," I said. "No occasion, no message, just a thank you." She took them quietly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. The kind of gesture people only make when they feel something real and don't know where to put it. "You know," she said, not quite meeting my eyes, "no one's ever brought me flowers. Not once. Isn't that something?" I smiled. "Then, I'm glad I came first." Over the following weeks, things changed, but not loudly. We didn't rush into confessions or label anything. We just spent time, walks in the park, short trips to the museum, where I discovered she had a soft spot for still life paintings of pears, glasses of wine on her small balcony, where we argued about music and agreed about cheese. We didn't talk much about the past. She didn't try to fix me, and I didn't try to turn her into someone else's apology. There was a quiet dignity in the space between us, something that didn't need to be explained. It was like breathing after holding. Your lungs too long underwater. She was not younger, and that was the point. There was no chase. No pretending. She simply was. Present. Real. Enough. One morning, I showed up at her shop again. This time, I wasn't empty-handed. I had 2 cups of coffee from the little place she liked down the street, hers with cinnamon, mine with just a dash of milk. The bell chimed. She looked up from a tray of fresh daffodils, her hands covered in green dust. "For you," I said, placing her cup on the counter. "Miss Sandra." She raised an eyebrow, half smiling. "And the bouquet?" I leaned forward, holding her gaze. "You pick it," I said softly. "Today. You're my reason." She didn't answer right away, but her eyes did.